Right. I have 4 o'clock on my watch. Are you ready, Dr.
Oh,
Lin-Hendel?
I
All right.
am. Let's see, at least
All
that's the
right.
hope.
I'm sorry.
I think so. Let's see how this clicking forward goes when I try it. There's probably going to be at least 1 minute of awkwardness.
Okay. No worries. Well, let me give you a proper introduction. So we are so pleased at AAVMP to welcome back Dr. Lin-Hendel. Dr. Erika Lin-Hendel is a VMD PhD, graduated from the UPenn Vet Med Scientist Training Program in 2016. Dr. Lin-Hendel consulted in the swine industry before shifting to small animal medicine to create more space for their advocacy work in mental health and social justice. They currently serve on the board of organizations, including Des Moines Pride Center and Iowa Queer Communities of Color Coalition. They're active in PrideVMC's DEI working group, where they've co-authored the Gender Identity Bill of Rights for the veterinary profession. And now Dr. Lin-Hendel also serves as chair of the Not One More Vet Student Support and Mentorship Committee and joined the Not One More Vet Board of Directors in 2022. So welcome, Dr. Lin-Hendel.
Thank you so much. All right, we're going to get started. Thank you everyone for being here on a Saturday. I hope that wherever you are, things are going well, and we'll hopefully have a lot to talk about and learn together today. So my first slide here just basically talks a little bit about what I hope to leave you with today, and that is shifting a perspective from imposter syndrome, which is typically assigned to a person and a person's dealing with on their own, to imposter phenomena, which acknowledges the fact that we are a product of our environment and that there are ways that we can shift both our experience by contributing to a culture that addresses this directly. Okay, let's see if. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to do is a big shout out, a big thank you to AAVMP for inviting me to talk to you today. And a lot of that had to do with Dr. Kelly Hewitt and connecting me with this organization. Secondly, I'd like to have a shout out to Dr. Taylor Miller. So Dr. Taylor Miller is one of my colleagues at Not One More Vet. And she, in addition to being a tremendous clinician and veterinarian, is also a mental health professional. So some of the shifts in language about the way that I think about imposter syndrome to imposter phenomena and how I've thought about that has really been started with my conversations with Dr. Miller. And I highly encourage you, if you ever have the opportunity to see her talk about mental health, I encourage you to do that. Brief land acknowledgement. In addition, I have to update this also to include a land and labor acknowledgement. And this basically reflects the fact that by where I live, living in this country and on these lands, I have lived on lands that have been occupied, colonized, and that the labor of people before me and people here today is often gone unacknowledged. Okay, so here's a QR code for you. This is in case getting onto the Mentimeter website was difficult. This is going to allow for some interactive discussion with us. All of that polling is anonymous, so you can feel comfortable to express yourself freely and know that I am available for further discussion in the future. Okay, so hi, it's lovely to meet you. This is a little bit to introduce you to the lens with which that I look at this topic, with any topic actually. And it comes from the background of being an Asian American. I'm a first generation American. Both of my parents are immigrants. It is a multicultural identity in my family. My father is German. My mother is Taiwanese. And this means that racism has shaped my life from a very young age, both inside the home and outside of the home. And I think that that's very important to address in discussing how we approach this concept of imposter syndrome and phenomena for BIPOC identity overall, and also with intersectional identity. So I'm also part of the queer community. I'm autistic and have ADHD. And I just wanted to share that I'll be approaching things from an intersectional lens. And I also wanted to point out some of the affiliation organizations that I have relationships with, and understand that the things that I am saying here today is from me. And if you have anything that you would like to talk about it, please direct it towards me. So this is a big topic. I actually was originally preparing to give this talk a couple of months ago. And today I'm going to take a moment because the Asian American community is in grieving. And also I wanted to say that the presentation that I would have given 2 months ago would be a little bit different than the presentation that I'm giving to you now. And that is because our community has experienced a loss during a time that is very important, so Lunar New Year. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that that holds an impact. It holds an impact on the way that we move through the world. And this is also in relation to how we experience mental health challenges and things like imposter syndrome and imposter phenomena. So take a moment to take a deep breath. And I wanted to say we are going to be talking about serious things today, and things that are impacted by serious things. So there are going to be things that I talk about in mental health, racism, sexism, ableism that might be difficult. And so if you find yourself in a moment having an emotional reaction, please take a break. If you need to, put your hand on your chest and take some deep breaths. If you need to step away, know that that is welcome. And hopefully that these are things that we can talk about together in a safe way. So my hopes for our shared time today is to define imposter syndrome and compare it to imposter phenomena, talking about the differences between how we think about those things. I'm going to talk about risk factors. Sorry, I'm shifting my screen so I can see things a little bit better. Risk factors and protection factors, how Asian American identity and intersectionality can feed into that, and how we process those things, and some tools and strategies. So in order to get a better understanding of how we collectively experience this, or what our experience is, I'd like to get to know you a little bit better. So we're going to use this Mentimeter. This will be the test question to see if we're having connectivity. Hopefully we are. And this information will be popping up. And please let me know where you're joining from. And that way we, oh, wonderful. I'm so excited that you are home. And this gives me an idea of some of our experience. Oh, and Columbus. All over the country. And hopefully some of these questions that I have will kind of reinforce this framework of the fact that we are shaped by the places we are in. Oh, I also see that people are dropping in notes in the chat as well. Thank you so much. Okay. How are you feeling right now? Another test question, but I want to make sure that we're holding space, tired, stressed. And this is kind of to emphasize the fact that imposter phenomena and how we navigate it contributes to what we experience overall in veterinary medicine, as an industry, as people, and all of these things can feed into burnout. And this is a component of why this is so important. Okay, what best describes your role in the veterinary team? And apologies, I know that we probably have students here. So if we put students, if you would put yourselves in other. I apologize. I should have updated this from the last conference that I was at. Oh, this is amazing. I'm very, very, very excited about this because hopefully we can leave you all with tools as well as information to have this be helpful for the community that you're in. So less than 5 years, 5 to 10 years, or 10 years. And this is an important component as far as how we build confidence through experience, right? And how long we're in a space or feeling comfortable or confident in our skills. Thank you. All right. That's really useful information. Okay, we're going to use this to ground because we have talked a lot about serious things and we will talk about serious things. I want you to hold on to something in your mind, something that you love about this industry. And anytime where you are feeling a little bit overwhelmed about the conversation that we're having, or in the future, this is a really good skill to use overall, to engage in something that you love that reminds you about why we're doing what we are doing. It can help us through a difficult emotional process. Compassion, helping. Yeah. This is also really important to think about how we express value, right? And how we view value. What comes to mind when you hear the word imposter syndrome or imposter phenomena? This might be a little bit difficult. Okay, don't belong, self-doubt, not feeling good, fake, fraud, feeling unworthy. I really want to draw attention to the feeling of not belonging, because that is an overlay and something that we overlay over our experience as marginalized identities within veterinary medicine, as far as a very not diverse field, that the feeling of not belonging, the discomfort, and that isolation that might come from that of feeling safe, whether or not you feel safe to express needs or needs for support, all of this can feed into how we experience this. Comparison to others, that's another thing. So keep that in the back of your mind about that comparison, right? It's an internal process involving interaction with an external experience. And that is impacted by our colleagues, the people who have authority over our commenting on our performance, how people engage with us, how we engage with each other. What are you hoping to learn in this talk? Mindset change, tools. Amazing. Yeah, you know what? There's a lot in here that is already part of the tools that are recommended, right? Perspective, mindset change, being understanding. How can you be kind to yourself? So that's also a very important thing to note, is how are we talking to ourselves and where does that language come from? How are we framing our discussions? All right, do any of these identities describe you? API, BIPOC ally, or an ally? And this is just also to remind ourselves in this discussion, oh, amazing, wonderful, that we have a mixed audience here, which is amazing. So we can talk about how we can support each other, especially when some of these things are influenced by racial identity and racial experience. Are any of these identities applicable to you? Immigrant, first generation, second generation? It does not apply. All right. This is also going to be a very useful conversation. So imposter phenomena, part of it, we talk about culture, right? And so what is valued by culture and what is perceived as success and good outcomes, how reward is given, and the things that are important. So this is for me as a first generation American and having immigrant culture from my family, there were different, potentially different conversations that were happening around the dinner table about what was success, what was acceptable performance to my parents for what I was presenting as a kid during school. All right. Have you had an authority figure or mentorship figure in vet med that looked like you? Yes, no, somewhat. All right. In the back of your mind throughout this talk, I would also like you to think about what that experience felt like. Some things that might be important, again, in the language that you use to talk to yourself. And how have you or a loved one experienced discrimination? Yeah. So there are a lot of yeses. And this is another component that or facet feeding into how we perform. How are we evaluating ourselves? And sometimes when there are things that are acting as barriers or obstruction to connecting with being able to perform at our best level, that can get in the way. Things like discrimination and racism. Okay. So thank you for answering those questions for me. And I know that perhaps they don't, on surface level, they might not necessarily link to imposter syndrome or phenomena at initial glance. But I'd like to offer up that they do, and it's very important to think about. So why does imposter phenomena matter for our industry? Well, overall, as an industry, we know that the veterinary field already has a trend of increasing stress. So I'm going to actually rephrase things as far as distress and at times increases in maladaptive coping. So there can be avoidant behavior, dissociation, a whole slew of substance misuse, a whole slew of behaviors that can be involved with maladaptive coping to increasing stressors. Additionally, all of these individual aspects that are challenges faced by our industry are connected in a lot of ways. And burnout is described as something incredibly common in industry and also at a higher rate for veterinarians. I'd like to say that imposter phenomena or this concept of feeling like a fraud burns a lot of emotional energy. And by having to try and face or engage with this aspect of burning of emotional energy, it increases the likelihood that we're going to slip into other aspects of burnout. So I would say that imposter phenomena, especially for people at the earlier part of their careers, is an important component of maintaining mental health and longevity within whatever the things you are doing. So imposter syndrome, I like to approach a lot of these things by starting out with the question, where does this come from? How did it come to be used in language? How is it defined? And this term itself started through in psychology to individuals, psychiatrists who were discussing high achieving women in the workplace in the 70s. And they describe this as an internal experience. So inside within a mental process of intellectual phoniness despite outstanding academic and professional accomplishment. So it is an internal process that is a result of an external value system, both how one perceives one's own value and how success is defined. A component of this is a fear, right? So this is a fear-based response, and it has to do with what happens when something is revealed. So the fear is that an individual will be unmasked as incompetent. And some of that process is the fear of what happens next. And again, this is something that can be influenced by cultural experience and personal experience at different stages of a person's life. So these are some of the syndrome facets. Now, when I first started thinking about imposter phenomena and imposter syndrome, I often dismissed it because I felt like, okay, I am kind to myself at times. I understand that some of the things that I'm doing are hard. I don't need to think about this. And it wasn't until I had conversations with Taylor that I started to understand that another component is not actually being satisfied about your successes or not caring about your successes, not celebrating them because you feel like you're just doing the work. And I think that that is something to keep in mind as well. So in addition to this component of doubt in yourself, in your skills, some of these things are also about not actually acknowledging the progress that you make and the successes that you have. There are also different personality types that are described as traits that are risk factors and commonly associated with imposter phenomena. And they're classified as perfectionist, the natural genius narrative, the expert, the individualist, and the superhuman. Now, these are categories that have been described by Dr. Valerie Young, who has been a prominent researcher involved in imposter phenomena and now has a whole institute dedicated to the study of this. So if you want, you can go explore things further. But one thing that I wanted to note, at least I'll describe these, and I want you to think about them and think about what you see in yourself. I would say that I actually have more than one of these traits in myself that I see on a regular basis that I have to work on regularly. The perfectionist. So as implied, pretty straightforward. Things have to be perfect in order for you to be satisfied with it. So if you make any individual mistake, that the value of your success is deemed as less worthwhile. The other thing about a perfectionist is that often they will continue to hold off on doing something until they can, or talk about something until it's perfect, or they feel competent enough in order to talk to other people. Now, one of the things about that that's a limitation is isolation. And isolation is something that results in imposter phenomena really getting deep-seated and potentially getting exacerbated. The natural genius narrative has to do with this concept of a talented individual at a young age that got a lot of reward by being quote unquote naturally good at something. And that leading into that doing things that are hard, that there can be a distorted connection to the learning process. And that results in someone avoiding engaging with things and their belief in themselves that they can learn how to do things if they're not good at it right away. The expert is an individual trait that results in needing to require as much information as possible so you can intellectually defend yourself and prove that you are quote unquote worthy. The individualist is a cohort of individuals that focus on being able to do everything themselves. That if they can't do everything and do everything well, that somehow needing help is indicative of weakness, or that their abilities are false. And then there's a superhuman. That is value associated with doing as much possible. One more thing, as many things as possible, because the ability to perform is associated with value. Now, there are not very many studies involving specifically AAPI individuals or BIPOC individuals, but overall, it has been suggested that those who have marginalized identity are at higher risk for imposter phenomena. And additionally, it's reported, there's been a single study in 2013 that showed that Asian Americans in that study had higher rates of imposter phenomena than other BIPOC community. And this was in this particular study related to a high incidence of perfectionism and a cultural component of discussing how high achievement was associated with perfectionism and the model minority myth, in which if people couldn't achieve what they perceived to be that imposter phenomena was more likely to be present in that person. Okay, another question. What traits do you see in yourself that are risks for imposter phenomena? So you can, on this slide, you can decide which ones resonate with you and at which number. And so we can get an assessment as an audience together. Where do you feel like you are impacted the most? Okay. We're seeing individualists and perfectionism come up the most. Yeah. That's really cool to see how we are all impacted by this and in what way. All right, perfectionism. Yeah. All right. So this is where I want to really kind of nail down this concept of imposter phenomena instead of imposter syndrome. So how we perceive success, how we define value, how we say this is a demonstration of excellence, right? That can be heavily influenced by the way that success was talked about in the home, the way that we talk to ourselves, the way that we talk to each other, that interpersonal space, the environment of a hospital or of a class, and then a culture like medicine. And so something I'd like to point out is that medicine in general is a high stakes scenario. So how we treat success, how we punish ourselves internally regarding mistakes is also a part of the culture of the industry that we're in. So it's not going to be for any individual facing imposter phenomena, it will be a helpful exercise to think about the broader picture, because what it means to me, at least, it gives me different areas of my life that I can think about and reflect on and unpack and consider how I'm defining success, how my expectations are for my own success and how I look at myself and how I talk to myself, and how I can encourage the people around me to ensure that imposter phenomena is not showing up. It's not just about how we're talking about each other in the clinic or how we're navigating medicine, but perhaps there might be someone who never got positive feedback when they were younger, right? So that's a big thing that we're talking about, how it shows up in individuals, because we're not just appearing in the clinic. We're coming from a long history and relationship for how we're talking about success and how we're talking about our learning. So as I said, it can start very young. So in my household that I grew up in, um, academic excellence was very much valued. And that if perfection wasn't demonstrated or achieved, that there were conversations around it. There was a punitive cycle. And so it made it a very natural process for me to be continuously focused on achieving as much as I could. And that if I made a mistake, that was something that I started internalizing and punishing myself if I wasn't achieving enough. And that meant that the rest of the progress that I was making was not something that I could connect with, because I wasn't achieving my PhD degree with grace, and that it wasn't 100% perfect. When I finished my PhD, it was more of a process of, okay, I'm done with it. So it's taken us some time to actually give myself the credit internally of the thing that I achieved. So this is an interesting question that I didn't put this in the chat or in Mentimeter, but I wonder how many of us had parents that were not as thrilled with our professional choices of career. I know that I heard a lot for many years. Why aren't you going to be a doctor? Right? Because to my parents, the medical doctor was elevated, was higher, right? And my parents were not in alignment with my path forward. And that was hard because it can make you feel alone. And when you feel alone, you might not feel safe. And when you don't feel safe, you can't talk about needing help. And if we can't do that within our own families, which there are many reasons why, right? My parents were trying to instill in me that this was a path forward for success in this country where they had made sacrifices to be here. And that is a very common immigrant story. We're not a monolith, though, right? Everyone's experience is going to be different. But I know that with mine, that was part of it. Another component that is brought up has to do with control and authoritarian parenting styles. My parents both came from very traditional cultures that were very conservative, and there's a lot of filial piety, right? So the expectation of obedience, compliance was something that showed up in our household. I mean, not to say that there wasn't a lot of love too, right? Tremendous amount. But my parents were also alone, right? They didn't have a whole lot of support. So they also had to focus on work. And all of these things contribute to how people are able to view themselves and their successes and how they can navigate feedback, right? My parents were not necessarily available to give me that iterative support and that process of learning in a way that also celebrates our failures. Because in their perception, not being excellent in these areas to their standards meant that I was more likely to have a difficult life. And they really wanted me to have all the tools that I needed for survival. And that can change the way that we look at failure. If failure has such a big consequence, we will do a lot of things to avoid it. If failure has such a big consequence, then it might be difficult to actually ask for help or acknowledge that we have learning to do. So this is probably a little bit of a difficult question, right? So I want to ask you, I already talked a little bit about my story, right? And I want you to think about the culture of feedback and success at home that you had. And we can change at home. We can talk about at grade school, at middle school, at high school, at college, right? At every stage of your life of education where you were considered lower in the hierarchy than somebody. What did that feedback and success discussion look like? I can tell you that for me, it usually didn't look good necessarily. And some of this can also relate to cultural differences. So one of the things that I experienced as a kid, I was supposed to write a story about the holidays. And I wrote a holiday about having blue crab for Thanksgiving because that was, something that my family did. And I got called in, my parents got called because the teacher thought it was a lie. And so this is an example of how cultural differences and how ignorance and racism can impact a person's experience in getting feedback of value, right? Instead of saying that was a very creative story or that was an interesting story, I want to learn more. Then it was instead, okay, we need to have an accountability conversation because I don't think this is true. Okay. Looks like we have a lot of variation, right? And I think that's important to think about that history that you have around how was success defined? How was that treated? How was attention and positive praise given or not given based off of those things from different authority structures in your life? And all of that can feed into how you show up for yourself and how you can show up for other people as well. And it gives us a lot of power to create a really positive culture where we can have these conversations and ensure that people aren't existing in a place of fear about the unknown of learning something new or trying to improve in different spaces or navigating a difficult case. All right. So this is this individuality component and utilizing imposter phenomena as a term that we can define. And it's this reframing that individuals are impacted by their experiences in the space that they exist in. That community and industry responses can have an impact that can either harm or foster imposter phenomena, or dispel imposter phenomena and support shifts. And that isolation is a big aspect of compounding the issue. And if we don't address these things, they have health consequences. So we're going to focus mostly about how we shift, right? So I've already talked about this. This is just reiterating that in addition to marginalized identities, family of origin, other traumatic experiences, perfectionism, new challenges and transitions can also be spaces where imposter phenomena shows up. And how this looks like. So you get a task or a project that is that needs to have some sort of output. And it is some sort of achievement based. This is usually how imposter phenomena is talked about. It's an achievement based process. And the pressure felt around achievement, expectation, and having to complete a thing. Now, if we're afraid of being discovered as a fraud, we might choose to not engage with that. That's normal. That's a very normal human response. And some of the ways that people can engage with avoidance can be things like procrastination, right? Or hyper-focusing, spending a lot of time trying to be prepared in order to accomplish this task. You choose a coping mechanism, you do the task, and then you believe that your success was due to this adaptive behavior, right? Or anything to do with but the work that you did and the effort that you put in and your abilities and skills and all of these things, right? Oh, I just had a great team. I was just at the right place at the right time. I just had really good training. Not, I am the person that put in the work, that engaged with this thing, that built the skills that I can be confident about, and I am proud of myself. Right? Two different ways of approaching how we look at our success. It's very common, right? We talked a little bit about how common, about it potentially being common in veterinary medicine. There is one study that suggests that looked at veterinarians. It was this study is based out of the UK, so it's a relatively new area of study. And 68% scored with imposter syndrome. They found in this study that women were more susceptible, and that it was also people who were in practice less than 5 years. So this concept of being new and growing our confidence, it suggested that this can shift over time with experience and learning. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that it's incredibly common. It's Gale and Matthews did a study just across the board with a lot of different people, and they estimate that 70 to 84% of people experience imposter syndrome throughout their lives. So in addition, there are some studies to suggest that 93% of medical students have experienced imposter syndrome. So although AAPI and BIPOC individuals are considered more at risk, and there are reasons why we could talk about that, it's incredibly common. And so one of the first things that we can dispel is that we're not alone. So we can talk about how we're feeling like this. If you say, hey, I'm kind of feeling ill-equipped, or I don't think that I'm actually good at this, I'm feeling like a fraud. If you said that to someone in your life in veterinary medicine, chances are they probably have felt the same way too at some point. And then you have an opportunity to talk about it. So I'm taking a moment to show this as far as spaces where we might experience it at different points in our career. Just because we're an early grad doesn't mean that we won't come up later in life if we have a change in position. So as we're expanding skills, as we're stepping into leadership, as we're practicing giving talks, as we're any number of new things, our relationship to that and how we move through it and how we feel good about the outcome or not good about the outcome can all relate back to this. So although our students and new grads are probably the people who are most susceptible, understand that just because you might be in a clinic where everyone has a lot of experience, it doesn't mean that they won't feel that way about a particular new space in their life. So this really focuses next on how it can show up on teams, right? We've talked about some susceptibility, what makes people more at risk. These are things that happen in interrelationary spaces, and we have the opportunity in teams to either support each other and uplift each other or not. And so some of these things that can cause imposter phenomena to be worse would be, for example, if there's a hierarchy, right? If someone has more power than another person, often, so for example, or like a technician veterinarian relationship, right? They're part of a team. Let's make that clear, right? We all are needed to have a successful team happen, right? Or a veterinary student and a clinician, right? If we have this concept of if some person in the hierarchy is not pleased with the outcome and that there's a potential chance for punitive action, how that imposter phenomena and the relationship to performance can happen, there's an area to create space for improvement and positive change. So how do we get through it? I think a big part of it is thinking about the environment. Systemic racism, classism, other biases were not involved in the conversation when the concept was developed. So often, some of these things feeling like an outsider. So there was some mention that somebody had stated that being an outsider or not feeling like you belong can contribute to this feeling of imposter syndrome. That's real. How people respond to your work product is also real. So if for some reason there is racism, bias, or discrimination at work, and you might be putting work in and the output and the appreciation or the way that you are evaluated is different because of that, that will 100% increase the experience of an individual of imposter phenomena, or feeling like maybe you aren't as good as you feel like you are, right? That confidence building, that encouragement, if it's not there, it's not really, you're not going to have that support. And so it seems very natural that in a space where there's absence of support, or that the way that you are interacted with is affected or by your identity, it can be very confusing and it can contribute to that space. So what I really feel pretty strongly about this statement: imposter syndrome directs our view towards fixing women at work instead of fixing the places where women work. So this is a really great article, and this article was presented 2021, right? So I think it is useful to revisit and take a look at. So I'm going to skip over this part because I'd like to leave us some time for questions. But intersectional identity results in how we talk, how we experience the world, and how multiple aspects of oppression can affect how people show up at work. So for me, these are parts of my story, right? And parts of why my family talked about achievement and success in certain ways, and how the expectation of how I look like and how I should act is interpreted both in the home and at work. And that affects how I communicate, and that affects how I view my success and how much I ask for help. And sometimes it took a long time for me to actually feel safe asking for help. From an Asian American experience, I think that assimilation as survival has been a component of how imposter phenomena shows up for me. And that is, assimilation means, to me, not making waves. Because at many times it was safer for me to be a wallflower and be as unobtrusive as possible. And in that space, I was not necessarily able to create a space for dialogue. How do I learn if it's just, with myself? I have to be able to have conversations in community and learn from other people. One of the big things that I think is important to consider is that when we are showing up in work in a high intensity environment, some of the emotional experiences that we've had throughout racism and our experiences with it are under the surface. And how am I supposed to perform at the same level of someone who's not experiencing that or carrying that? It's not going to be possible. And so having a space of support where diversity, equity, inclusion is valued, and where people can understand that there exists bias, and that when someone is looking at me as a femme-bodied Asian human being, that when I'm asking questions, I am not being argumentative. I'm not being difficult. I'm asking questions. And these are things that can affect how supervisors interact with me or how peers interact with me. And it has historically, on occasion, been a difficult aspect of my career. And now I have the language to move through that. So I think that's important to consider. So some of the things that you can do for yourself: approaching things with curiosity, cultivating mindfulness and self-compassion, engaging in building community support wherever you can find it, and fostering your resilience and giving it space to expand. So when we're looking at imposter syndrome and imposter phenomena, I want you to think about how you talk to yourself. How do you treat yourself when you make mistakes? How do you set up your expectations, and how do you define and celebrate your success? What processes do you have for that? And think about how different experiences in your life might have shaped that. A big part of that is going to be stepwise learning and engaging in positive places where you can learn in a safe way. Thinking about good enough rather than perfect. Asking questions, reality checking with people that you trust. And that's the most important thing about not leaning into isolation. Sharing that with someone, and practice asking for help. When you're approaching it teams, you each individually have the ability to break that cycle in yourself and with other people. One thing that I think is really helpful is continuously engaging and giving positive feedback, expressing appreciation for people. And sometimes you can work together to ensure to find common ground. Maybe you learn that things are really difficult for other people too. And then you can work together to figure other things out, learn things together. I can lean in and say, hey, I haven't managed many of these types of cases. What do you like to do? Would you be willing to share that with me? Or, hey, I think that it's really cool how you do this particular surgical technique. Would you mind showing me? That kind of conversation can build community. And in my opinion, community is the space where imposter phenomena will cease to exist. Okay, so I'm actually going to pass over this one. I'm not going to talk about it too much. I do have it here for people to answer if they want. I think that this is important when we talk about encouraging spaces for mentorship. And I just want you to think about this. Hold this in your mind about the mentorship or professional relationships that really sparked you to feel good about yourself, to have the courage to engage in something new, or that gave you the confidence to try something that was scary. And I think that these are spaces of learning, right? And if you have the opportunity to be a mentor to someone, understand that the way that people are talking to themselves is showing up in learning spaces, in clinical spaces, and normalizing how we engage in compassionate feedback, compassionate accountability, encouraging and uplifting each other. All of these things are things that can dispel imposter phenomena. These are things that we can talk about in the greater context of our industry. Regardless of our background, we can work together to deconstruct bias and oppression. We can engage in universal design and accessibility to ensure that no one is missing the tools that they need to be successful. We can engage in nonviolent communication to support each other through difficult times within the clinic when mistakes will be made. We can increase access to learning. We can deconstruct the language around toxic perfectionism. We can normalize the process of first attempt in learning, fail forward, right? Making progress and building systems of support, both within ourselves, in our interpersonal relationships, in our communities, as far as a practice, a class, a lab. Every single day you can apply it on multiple levels. And this is just another moment of my soapbox. All of this, if you create equity spaces and inclusive spaces, you can then build the trust to create space where people can ask for help and people can be vulnerable. And we can't do any of that in spaces that don't have that accessibility and that universal design. Okay. I know that was a lot of information, potentially a whirlwind, and a little bit pinging around because this is a pretty difficult topic. But if you would like to put on your video, give me some company and ask me anything, any questions from the audience about this topic.
Do you have any questions for Dr. Lin-Hendel? That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Most welcome. Do you have any questions for me?
I think I'm still a little bit amazed by how much I related to pretty much everything you just said. So there's like this miasma happening right now. I'm still processing.
Yeah. I remember that moment where, because Dr. Taylor Miller and I were going on a trip to talk about mental health for a group. And one of the topics that she was covering was imposter phenomena. And I was like, oh, I got this. Like, I am like, hey, tomorrow is another day. You'll be okay. Like, mistakes happen.
Are you still there?
I'll go a long time, of course. And you're really dedicated. Like, there are really things that are of value in all of that. And that's the moment where I was like, oh, wow, no, I've been dealing with this my whole life. Oh, May, thank you so much. I am so glad that you found this informative. Yeah, I think that it's very important to deconstruct these terms because we hear them a lot. And I think often in our industry, we're so focused on what we're doing in our work that we're like, yeah, anxiety, yeah, depression, yeah, all of these things. And I mean, I've done that before. And then there's that moment when I, look into it more where I'm like, oh, yes, no, this shows up in my life every single day.
I did just think of a question.
Yeah.
So I was curious what your thoughts were, or if there's any data on, people who say, oh, I don't have imposter syndrome. But that it's more pervasive than the surveys probably say, because people just don't realize that they're acting out on it, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think so. And actually, some of the study, like, it is considered one of the most common experiences across the United States. A lot of the research that I looked at, they were like, yeah, 70, like very few things will be like 70%, 70 to 80% of the population has experienced it at one point in their life or another, right? It's incredibly common. And I think that the studies that demonstrate that are very, are a helpful first step, right? Where you can say, okay, cool. If you don't think that, that's fine. But a lot of people do. So maybe you can help. That's a way that I engage in it a lot, saying that you might be able to help someone else. As we start to continue to talk about this as something that's beyond the individual, that is created over time, from multiple experiences, that's a big part of it. And I think that usually that's the time where people are like, oh, never mind, says the cat feeder. Background noise. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know how helpful it is, but what I usually tell the students is it's the ones who say they don't have imposter syndrome that you have to worry about.
Oh. Yeah. I think that thinking about how it shows up and recognizing that it shows up differently in different people, and it can show up in different areas of our lives too. So just because I might feel very confident in one part of my life doesn't mean that it won't show up somewhere else. And I think that it can also be a tactic for our brains to say, okay, well, I've got this here, I must have it everywhere. Like I am confident here. I don't need to think about this problem because in this area, I'm very celebratory about my successes and feel really confident and good. And it's a diversion technique, I think, to avoid, taking care of ourselves as whole people, because that's really hard and takes a lot of work.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
I'm literally like sitting in my bed in my pajamas. So
Oh, fantastic. I'm so glad that you're cozy.
Yeah. But I guess and it's kind of a two-pronged question. And I think, like in my experience and personally, in terms of like one of the things I struggle with most with like kind of the imposter syndrome part is because I guess at any point, at some point, we're all going to make a mistake, right? And I think especially I'm the second year now, and so we're getting closer and closer to clinics, and as a new grad, you're a new associate or whatever, you're going to be making decisions that matter, and they're not always going to be right. And so, what would you say your advice is to kind of they say be kind to yourself, but that's so much easier said than done,
Oh, yeah.
and I think that's, very buzzwordy, and I'm like, I'm not I kind of try to stay away from buzzwords, but like, what can you do to kind of like build that network? And then also, as students, as we are still students now, like, I always try to remind myself that like, now's the time to ask the questions and to say you don't know, and to like put yourself out there and make those mistakes. And like, how can students now, can we make the most of our time? And then also, how can we help ourselves down the road and now as well?
Well, helping yourself now and down the road is a continuous process, because the things that you do to help yourself now are things that you will use to help yourself in the future. So first of all, I'm gonna say that as far as every single step that you take to like being here today, having conversations with people about it, these are all things that are planting seeds, and some of them grow at different rates, but they're living things, right? So as a student, trying to be the most effective you can with your time, this is how my approach is. I think about what are the things that are mistakes, that are big mistakes, big risks, right? With the particular thing that I am learning. And what are the habits that help me catch those? So, okay, so for an example, medical mistake, injecting the wrong thing in the wrong place, right? So if you make a mistake, right, having that deconstruction process of saying what happened, right? What was going well? What didn't go well? What could have been done differently, but in the voice of how do we shift moving forward? And I think it's the not defining yourself by that mistake and learning how to continuing to engage in the learning process to say mistakes happen. There are big ones and small ones. What things can we put in place to prevent? And how can I ask those questions? And that curiosity can help. The other thing is reducing mistakes is by being rested, being fed, and feeling like you have the space to breathe. And I know that is very, very difficult to implement as a student, but try and remind yourself of that. So when someone is saying, oh, you misspoke, or how dare you make that mistake, and you're like, I'm going off of 5 hours of sleep, like that would be a thing to think about as you're talking to yourself. If you're going to beat yourself up because you are so exhausted that you can't remember the word for a particular parasite, like that is something to recognize that, like, hey, these are not conditions for me to necessarily perform at this level. What can I do to make sure I have the space to do that? Or if I am exhausted, like I will go and I'll show up at clinic and I'll say, hey, I didn't sleep well last night. Can we check each other today? Right? I talk to my staff about that regularly because they do have insomnia. It's much better now, but on those days where I'm exhausted or I'm really hungry, we say, like, my brain is not mathing today. And I just say that my brain is not mathing today. It does not mean that it does not math well at other times, but today in this moment, it is not. I am going to use a calculator. I am going to ask someone to double check my math, regardless of what role they have in the hospital. I would totally ask a CSR to double check my math if that was the only other person in the building that didn't have something going on immediately to help me, because they can be just as good as math as I can be, right? So that's kind of the normalization of how we engage with these mistakes, right? And trying to reframe them in learning. I hope that's helpful.
And can I add something from the perspective of a professor?
Yeah.
So, even although professors may give you the impression that they know everything and they are perfect, they are not. They're all human. We are all human. We have made all the same mistakes that you've made at some point, and we survived and we got to where we are, so you can too. So just remember that,
Oh, also note.
I think honestly, the hardest thing for me is feeling dumb in front of my classmates, to be honest. Like, again, it goes back to that comparing to others. Like, I think that's, you know what I mean? Like, sometimes I won't ask a question because I'm more concerned about looking or sounding dumb in front of 150 people than I am necessarily to the professor, because I know that they know that I'm learning. I don't know.
Right.
I think that's harder for me, if I'm honest.
I think that competition is very natural, and I like engaging in kind of undermining that. So part of it is you can start practicing by finding safe ways to ask questions for you. Like, it's not necessary to ever feel comfortable asking questions in front of 150 people, in my opinion. Right? Like, I think that is perfectly normal and okay to have that emotional process and fear in front of 150 people. I would still feel that way today too. Right? And so I think that when we are in positions so this is why I use polling things that are anonymous. right? I
Yeah, I
encourage
love
a lot of
that.
educators to do that as well, to say, let's create an anonymous space to ask questions, because we are all different, and raising a hand and asking questions in front of 150 people is not an accessible format. It is specifically designed for a cohort of people, and those people are often more extroverted, right? So yeah, I think that's something to recognize, that like when we're feeling those things, I think it's also important to say that's normal. I think that's normal. And I don't think that you ever have to be comfortable asking questions in that way, and that you can ask questions in other ways that are more comfortable, and build up your confidence to asking those questions in ways that work for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I do ask a lot of questions, ironically, but
You know what? I think questions are great. I think that curiosity is really helpful for unpacking a lot of things. And I think that embracing in that you can both create safe space for other people, and also for yourself in your journey.
Any other questions for Dr. Lin-Hendel? Well, on behalf of AAVMP, I want to thank you so much again for coming back and hanging out with us and giving us another stellar presentation. Thank you so much. Well, one of these days I have to meet you in person so
Absolutely.
we can
I would
compare notes.
absolutely love that. That would be absolutely amazing. Thank you everyone for being here. And know that you can reach me at any of the organizations that I work with, and also Dr. Sakamoto has my information, as well as I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook. You can find me and message me. I'm happy to have a conversation.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And have a great rest of your weekend, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.